Okay, so previously we spoke about some of the longer term factors leading to the creation of an American identity that are really sort of pushing folks on the road to revolution, but are also creating these kind of regional identities at the same time. So we're sort of juggling several different poles, I guess, at the same time. I want to look specifically at um, some of the trigger factors then, right? What lead to trigger factors that lead specifically to revolution, even though, again, it's not a foregone conclusion that this American identity is going to win out, that even the majority of the colonists are going to support this. Yet we already have a number of longer term factors in place pushing people in that direction. We'll also start thinking about some of the contradictions of the revolution that seem inherent to the revolution in and of itself, and that's actually what I'll spend some more time talking about in the second half of the class. So we looked at native wars, for example, as being one of these factors that I argue at least helps create an American identity, right? It's pushing people to think beyond their individual identities, their family identities, the identity of their town, even the identity of their colony, and kind of be concerned about what's happening in other colonies, right? In many ways, I think that is kind of the definition of a nation, right? You care about what's happening even though it's not directly next to you, right? Some other part of the colony. In some ways, I think they're already starting to function as a nation because they're thinking about internal enemies like Native Americans or internal enemies like slave revolts. Right? So in New York, they're concerned in 1739 when Stono, South Carolina, has a revolt. Virginia is very concerned. Right? They say, hey, do you need help? Do you need troops? Right? They send troops to help. They change laws in their own colonies to try to control their own populations. So in many ways, they're being affected by these kind of national events. Right? These are really national events. Hard for us maybe to wrap our mind around that in an era before television and the internet and Twitter, right? Or now we can talk to somebody wherever, at the touch of a button. Some of you are doing so right now as I speak. No, I'm just kidding. But imagine this: how else do you create a national community? Like things like newspapers and pamphlets would have done it now, right? Word spreading, Paul Revere on the back of a horse running around spreading the word. It's a different kind of world, but you still have the need and the necessity to create a larger community if you're going to create a nation. So think about things like slave revolts, think about native revolts, the Great Awakening. Many historians call this the first national event in the 1730s. There will be a second one later in the 1770s and 1780s. So there are a number of factors already in place. We talked about, in particular, the native conflicts and conflicts with natives, I should say, culminating with the French and Indian War in 1763. Just as the British sort of breathed a sigh of relief in 1763, that they have finally kind of dealt with the French, right? That they're finally sort of getting a type of mastery in the New World. There is a bill that's due. Right? There's a bill that's due that has to be paid. And this is going to lead to increased tension with the British colonies because Britain wants us to pay the bill, at least to chip in. From Britain's perspective, they were expending all this money and manpower to help defend us, so we should pay for this. We should pay for this bill. We're like, look, we're colonists. That's your deal. You're the mother country. You're the all-powerful, providing all these raw materials. Why should we pay this bill as well? Right? You're defending your empire. I argue that in some respects, we're already seeing maybe a growing distance between Britain and her colonies, right? Because if you're 100% loyal, unquestioning, you just pay the bill. Right? But if you're starting to think of yourself as separate, even this early on, you might have some questions about that bill. Why should I pay? You go to dinner with your friends, and the bill comes, and you don't. Somebody doesn't want to chip in. You feel a certain kind of way about that. Well, you ate. Now you should all, chip in on the bill. You benefited. Shouldn't you pay? But what if that person says, I didn't eat anything? Why should I pay, $10 like everybody else? That seems unfair to me. You're mistreating me. You're trying to enslave me. These are some of the arguments you're going to hear in the Revolutionary era. And again, it's not coincidental, I would say, that a number of the arguments that get made are things like, you're trying to enslave us, King George, right? Because slavery is going to be one of these contradictions that's still being thought about and dealt with. We're going to think about that a little more. So just as Britain kind of wins out, particularly not removing the French menace totally, but really kind of dealing with them by 1763, after the French and Indian War, there was this heavy debt that Britain saddled with, and they're trying to figure out ways to deal with that debt. They're also, I think, trying to figure out ways to better manage these colonies that are growing, that are getting a sense of themselves, that are becoming more and more profitable. Right, so there's a lot of things perhaps at play, and it's about economics, but not just economics. It's also about control. Right, there's a power relationship that's being negotiated between Britain and her colonies. Um, Parliament starts to look for ways to generate revenue. We talked about benign neglect before, how Britain gets concerned with the issues that it has to deal with, whether it's wars with European powers in Europe or the English Civil War, internal events that cause them to forget about the colonies for a time, cause them to let the colonies do their own thing. The colonists enjoy this freedom, right? This is why historians call it benign neglect, because they weren't so mad that they're being neglected, that they didn't have Britain looking over their shoulder and making all the decisions for them. They develop a kind of tradition of local governing in some ways. These colonial assemblies get more and more vocal and start to make their own decisions. And so they're going to react negatively when then Britain tries to reassert power. From their perspective, a rightful reassertion of power, but from the colonial perspective, it feels like an imposition. It feels like oppression. So we'll see how that happens, particularly in this decade after 1763. So benign neglect ends basically in 1763. At the end of the French and Indian War, it's over. Britain is going to pay more and more attention to its colonies, going to try to reorganize some things, going to try to raise revenues. All of these things are going to be troublesome to the colonists. With the pressing need for tax revenues, we're going to see a number of specific taxes that are going to cause a reaction, that are going to cause a colonial reaction. The first may be the Sugar Act. Now again, I want you to think about how this is part economics, but it's also some other stuff happening. It's not just about the money. It's not just about the money. So for example, the Sugar Act in 1764 is a good example. With the Sugar Act of 1764, Britain actually lowered the tax on molasses and sugar. They actually lowered it. So it's not just about the money. So they actually lowered the tax, the duty on molasses that had been in place for 30 years or so. But they also would step up efforts at policing this trade, to stop smuggling, to stop the colonists dealing with others like the Dutch. So they say, okay, we'll lower the tax, but you can't trade with the Dutch anymore. You're our colony. Remember mercantilism? You're supposed to only trade with us. All these navigation acts and such that had not been enforced so strongly. Now we're going to enforce them. But again, it's not just about the money, because the act actually lowered the taxes. If it was just about the money, folks would have been happy. They're not happy about this because it feels like control. They step up efforts to reduce smuggling and the bribery of local officials and all sorts of things that the colonists had gotten used to, and that had made their earlier tax kind of ineffective. They're clamping down. The colonists would complain and make specific arguments that the new British policy violated their rights, particularly the right to assess their own taxes. The colonists are like, look, there's 1.6 million of us by 1770. Can't we make our own taxes? Can't we make these decisions ourselves? They feel like this violates their rights. But this first act is not going to lead to overnight revolution. There's not even widespread violence or anything, as you're going to see later on, to this first act. People are upset, but they're not super upset. Maybe one of the reasons why they're not over the top upset is because this first Sugar Act maybe affects some more than others. It's going to heavily affect those merchants and such in the Northeast and ports like Boston, right? Again, where radicals seem to be springing up, right? These merchants are becoming more and more upset. But it doesn't affect everybody equally, right? You just not use sugar. Most poor folks don't have a whole lot of sugar anyway. Right? So they're like, okay, we don't like it, but it's not really affecting us right now. Some later taxes, though, are going to affect wider and wider numbers of people and are going to cause even more of a reaction. But this first act does not lead to mass protest. The next one, though, the Stamp Act, will lead to major unrest. So 1765, the Stamp Act is going to cause major unrest. This is basically, the Stamp Act is basically a tax on written documents. So you had to buy, a certain type of paper with a stamp on it to make it legal, essentially. Newspapers had this stamp, legal documents had this stamp, licenses. And this was seen as affecting everybody more directly. Not just the wealthy are going to be impacted by this, not just the Northeast, but everybody feels impacted by this Stamp Act in 1765, in part because of the nature of the tax. And there's going to be a colonial reaction to it. They're not just kind of taking these things lying down at this point, which again shows you they're already thinking of maybe a greater distance between themselves and Mother England. They're still loyal British subjects, but they're starting to maybe question that on at least some level. How do they react? Well, they decide to all get together and meet. Colonial leaders would get together in October 1765 in direct reaction to the Stamp Act. So we call this the Stamp Act Congress. Think about what this means. This is a group of colonial leaders coming together and beyond their individual colonial identities, basically doing what nations do. They have a kind of national response to talk about how should we react to this. So this Stamp Act Congress comes together, not to, load up the guns. They're not to that point yet. They're not that upset yet. But they do come to word a strongly written letter, to draft a strongly worded letter. They're going to, tell the king, they're going to give him the what for, basically. But not really. The letter is actually pretty conciliatory. They say things like, "Oh, wise king, would you please reconsider this act? We are your loyal subjects, right? We're not, any rabble. We shouldn't be mistreated this way. Oh, wise one." They're still very kind of forgiving and still very conciliatory to who they consider their rightful ruler. But they do write the letter. Right? They are questioning the ability of this absolute monarch to make these rules. So it's still a step, I would say, in the direction, ultimately, of revolution. But it's a very conservative step. They're not calling him crazy names or doing stuff as of yet. But this Stamp Act Congress is still important. Right? They're not confrontational, but it's still, I think, an important step. It also may be considered important because this Stamp Act Congress is the first time that these colonial leaders have met in over a decade. Since about 1754, remember when Franklin's Albany Plan of Union and all that. So this Stamp Act Congress is the first time that they, again, come together as a group to formulate a group response to what they feel like is not a good situation for them. So again, it's important for that reason. On a local level, there's a reaction to the Stamp Act as well. Common people are not waiting for their leaders to decide how to react here. They're going to have their own reactions. Some of the things they start doing are intimidating those hired to sell the stamps. They're going to intimidate folks, maybe beat some folks up, right? So much so that most of the guys selling the stamps would quit their jobs by 1766. They kind of say, "Hey, it's not worth it. These colonists are crazy. They obviously have a problem. I didn't do it. I'm just carrying out the law." So this intimidation of these individuals is again an important step. You're questioning the king's messengers, if not the king himself. They're making their voice heard, even on a common level. That's going to be important. You don't have to wait, for your leaders to sort of tell you how to feel about this. Common people are already finding themselves drawn more and more, perhaps, into what is slowly becoming a movement. Right? And there's a reaction to this. The Parliament hears about this. British Parliament says, "You know what? Maybe we should rethink this. In 1766, the British Parliament votes to repeal the Stamp Act. So they won. They made their voices heard, they voiced their displeasure, and the Parliament's like, okay, no, we didn't mean to offend you. They repealed the Stamp Act at that moment. But Parliament still wants to exert control over these colonies. They still want them to know who's in charge. So even though they would repeal this particular act that had been seen as offensive, they declare their right to tax the colonies however they want to. They say, look, we'll roll back this one, but that doesn't mean tomorrow we might not put something else in place if we decide that it's necessary and that it's effective. Yes.
Who ruled England, Parliament or the King?
Both, really. It depends on the moment, but yeah, it's kind of a back and forth. You have different moments of constitutional monarchy and whatnot. In some ways, maybe the Americans are going to look at that and think about notions like separation of powers. Who rules the U.S.? Is it the president? Can he do whatever he wants or she wants? You got to get stuff through Congress. You got to, legislative branch, the judicial, the executive. So there's some balance of power there, but the king and the monarch is still much more powerful, in fact, than a U.S. president, I would say, even today. But yeah, there's some back and forth and some choice over that later, and now, the monarch's really more of a figurehead, right? The Queen of England's somebody nice, but she's not all powerful. Put it that way. I don't disrespect the Queen, but she's more of a figurehead now. But you're right, there's a complicated system there. Parliament is the one specifically making the laws having to do with its colonies several thousand miles away, and that might be the problem itself. There's a distance there, a gulf there, literally an ocean in between them, in a very literal sense. So they roll back that Act 1765, but they also declare the Declaratory Act as their right to tax. They declare their right to tax. They basically call dibs on the fact that they can put some new taxes in place if they desire to do so. And they do. The very next year, they would put in place the Townshend Acts. 1767. These were taxes on a number of different properties, number of different items.
Right.
Thank you. I'm having trouble with words today. Cold medicine, I guess. So the Townshend Acts included things like a tax on glass and lead, paper, once again, paint, and tea. So a number of different products that ultimately may impact everybody. It's not just one thing that only a few people use. It's a number of acts that are going to be taxed. And this leads to further protest. These Townshend Acts would lead to more colonial protest. And remember, the colonies have grown up. There's 1.6 million of them by this point. They're starting to feel themselves more powerful. They feel like their role in the empire maybe is changing. They feel like they're not represented in Parliament, and so this is an issue. You start to hear phrases like no taxation without representation. They're not properly represented as colonies. And so they're starting to feel their own power a bit. And they say, how should we make our voice heard this time? One of the things they decide to do is begin a non-importation movement. Non-importation movement. Basically, it's exactly what it looks like. We're not going to import British goods. If you're going to mistreat us, we're not going to buy your products anymore. There are 1.6 million of us. If we decide no longer to buy British products, you're going to feel it in your pocketbook. If you don't respect us, we'll make you respect us based on our economic power. So non-importation is basically a boycott, a large, massive boycott of British goods, and colonists vow to not import these British goods until the taxes are lifted. What's interesting about non-importation, once again, is this is not just a handful of colonial leaders. Anybody could participate in this non-importation movement, and they will. Women, for example, especially women that are in charge of household goods, say, okay, we're not going to buy the British stuff, we'll buy this other stuff. Right? So women all of a sudden are directly connected to this growing revolution. Poor people can choose not to import certain goods, not just luxury goods, but everyday items. Again, think of this as maybe having a galvanizing effect and pulling people into a kind of American identity. They're part of a movement. Even though this is still relatively early, they're part of a movement. All of the taxes were ultimately repealed, except for the tax on tea. So all of these taxes are ultimately taken back by the British, except for the tax on tea, which is a particularly significant one. The British Tea Company has a lot of say in Parliament, for example, so they're able perhaps to get their voice heard. And we know tea is going to become a particular sticking point. In 1773, the British passed a Tea Act. It passes a Tea Act specifically about tea. Again, it's not just about the money. It's not only about the money. This Tea Act requires the colonists to buy their tea from the British East India Company. Like, okay, you have to buy from the British company. You can no longer buy from the Dutch company, which is what the colonists wanted to do, had been doing. They have deals with the Dutch. They say, look, remember mercantilism, you have to buy from us. We're the mother country. Again, it's not just about economics, I'm saying, because the act actually lowered the legal price of tea. Actually lowers the price. So the British feel like, look, we'll lower the price, they'll be okay with it, but they'll be having to buy it from us, right? So everybody wins from a British perspective. The colonists, though, protest because they see the act as a way of sneaking in a tax without proper representation. No taxation without representation. We don't have a voice in Parliament. Right? We shouldn't have to just basically pay and be oppressed, to be treated like a slave, essentially. Yeah.
You said by 73, all the previous acts were.
All the Townshend Acts have been removed, yeah, because the Townshend had been things like glass, paper, as well as tea. They take all the ones except the tea.
The only act that was active was
the tea. Mm-hmm. So these colonists feel, again, it's not just about politics, it's about economic and politics, economic and political power. And many are starting to see really an overlap between the two. Sometimes your wallet and how you're treated economically may show you how much someone respects you. I think they're really making a connection between the two there. Also, economics is important, though. Many New England merchants in particular stand to lose money off this, right? Many of these New England merchants in port cities like Boston are going to lose money if this Tea Act is actually enforced. So it's not a coincidence that the Tea Party happens in Boston. These wealthy merchants especially feel like they're being particularly targeted and impacted by this. These protesters would, in Boston, dump the British tea into the harbor to kind of voice their displeasure in specific response to the Tea Act. They say, okay, we'll show you what we think of your tea. I put it at the in the bottom of the harbor.
They dressed up as they do that.
Yeah, something going on. Some strange things going on with that. So they dress up as Native Americans. I've seen competing theories about this. Some of it may have just been camouflage, like we don't want us to know who specifically did it. But there may have been some other stuff going on there too. Some talked about it as a tradition of resistance. Maybe we can talk about this more when we have the Native American mascot controversy debate. You guys get mad at me when I talk about your Washington Redskins, but that'll be later. Let's talk about that. I don't know. I'm not 100% sure on why that would have been the case, but there were some interesting theories about this, kind of taking on that persona, and that it allowed them to do what they needed to do, and then kind of step back into their own lives in some interesting ways. It's a good question. It's a good question. In retaliation for this Tea Party, because the British did not find it humorous at all, Britain cracks down heavily, particularly on Boston. The first thing they do is close the port, shut down the port. Say, okay, you want to play? We'll shut down, your ability to trade out of this major colonial port. Right? Shut the port down. They also restructured the Massachusetts legislature. They look at these colonial assemblies as maybe being troublemakers at this point. And they're going to shut them down and kind of reassert control. Remember, there's a a growing tradition of local control, local governing control. We talked about Virginia, right? House of Burgesses going all the way back to 1619. So by this point, that's 150 years of making at least some rules yourself. Britain says, well, maybe that's an issue, right? Maybe you're getting a little too full of yourself. So they want to restructure the Massachusetts legislature. They restrict the meeting of people. All these radicals in Boston, these rabble rousers, these troublemakers will allow them not to meet. And to enforce this, they're going to send in troops. They send in troops to kind of be a presence and reassert colonial control. And of course, this is going to lead to trouble. Once there are troops on the ground, and there's a possibility of tension between these troops and the locals. This British response, the British called it the coercive acts. They want to coerce the colonies into behaving the way colonies are supposed to behave. Use coercion to do so. The colonists called these acts intolerable. So from the British perspective, they were coercive acts. From the colonial perspective, they were intolerable, something they could not tolerate. These are the intolerable acts. This leads to, again, a colonial response. They decide to meet and decide how should we respond to these intolerable acts. This meeting is called the First Continental Congress, 1774. So the intolerable acts lead directly to the First Continental Congress. During this first Congress in 1774, delegates from each colony tried to decide on their next move. So again, they're thinking as a nation. Each colony is going to send representatives essentially, and they're going to try to, decide as a group how should they respond. The next year, there are some skirmishes, some violence between the poorly armed colonists and British troops in Lexington and Concord. These sort of early important battles that really kind of kick things off in 1775. So by the time the Second Continental Congress meets in 1775, the chances of kind of forgive and forget are really going away. Right? Once people start dying, it's difficult to just say, I'm sorry, and let's go back to the way things were. You kind of reached a tipping point by 1775. So as they're meeting, this Continental Congress is meeting, violence has already sort of begun. Violence is in the air. Tension is in the air. Delegates to the Second Continental Congress in 1775 would really begin to direct the early war effort to determine how they're going to fight this war. One of the things that they do is appoint George Washington as its commander. Washington seemed like a good choice. He has particular experience from these earlier colonial wars, has sort of made a name for himself. He's a Virginian. Right? A lot of these events are happening in Boston and New England. So how do you bring in the southern colonies and sort of ensure their allegiance to this? Remember, they're not a nation yet. Right? One of the ways is to appoint a prominent Virginian so that everybody sort of has a stake in this movement. He seemed like a good choice. He's going to be a very popular choice, both as commander and later as the unanimous choice for president. Even as late as 1775, though, these leaders are very hesitant to declare independence. One reason may be that they know that most of the colonists are not really ready for that step yet. It's one thing to feel like you're defending yourself and whatnot. It's another thing to declare independence. And from the British perspective, essentially commit treason, to leave the empire. That's a huge step that folks are moving towards, but they still may not have been ready for that yet. At least the delegates don't feel like there's enough popular support in place for that step yet. Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, in 1776 helps to kind of galvanize people towards independence. Thomas Paine's pamphlet would do things like question why should us we as colonists remain loyal to the king. He says it's common sense that we have our own nation. It's common sense. We reached that point. It's almost a step of common sense. His pamphlet is going to have a tremendous impact on public opinion. Right? It's an instant bestseller. Again, before internet, before all these technologies that help us stay connected now, a pamphlet would be a good way to get this message out broadly and to get it to common people. Not just among the leadership, but common people are reading this and drawn to it, and it's an instant bestseller. He argues that the colonists have no obligation to the British king. We have no obligation to the British king, who by his actions had, quote, surrendered his claim to the colonists' obedience. So Paine says, look, we were loyal subjects, but he's mistreated us. And because he's mistreated us, we no longer have to remain loyal to someone who's abusing us, trying to enslave us, trying to take away our property, our God-given rights. So you're seeing a subtle yet very important move here, questioning absolute monarchy, questioning a number of traditional relationships here. So it says, the king by his actions had surrendered his claim to the colonists' obedience. Many people see this document as a direct attack on the idea of kingship generally, right? We have a different form of government, perhaps. Government, by the people, for the people. It's very different than monarchy in that sense, absolute monarchy. Paine's essay would lay part of the intellectual foundation for American republicanism, right? This idea of a republic and, again, government should work for the people rather than vice versa. It's also an appeal to the common man, common people, right? That you have a part in this revolution. It's going to help galvanize especially common people. Backcountry people are drawn to this movement in part based on Paine's common sense. People in the backcountry and the West, what would have been considered the West. Many of these non-English immigrants are drawn to this. Scots, Irish, Germans. It really helps galvanize a movement that had been crystallizing, but had not really maybe tipped towards the idea of full independence. With public opinion more firmly behind independence by this point, although there are going to be a number of loyalists that remain even throughout the war, there'll be a large loyalist contingent. The Second Continental Congress voted to declare independence on July 2nd, 1776. July 2nd, 1776, they vote to declare independence. A committee headed by Thomas Jefferson is chosen to draft the formal document, formal declaration, which is going to be then signed 2 days later. That's why we celebrate July 4th as Independence Day. At this point, the war is on, and now it's become a revolutionary war. There's sort of no turning back at this point. Once you've declared your independence, you question the right of the king to assess these taxes and to rule you any further. At this point, you've reached a tipping point in the conflict. Okay. I want to get those sort of road to the revolution things out of the way because I want you to really think about this era broadly defined. Your next thought process is really going to have to do with the revolution and really the larger age of revolution. Obviously, there are a number of contradictions developing already. There are a number of contradictions already developing, even as this national identity, this American identity, this rhetoric of equality and liberty is being laid out in very strong terms. There are a number of contradictions bound in it that have to be dealt with. Sort of like you did with your first major project, I want you to start thinking about your next project, which is going to deal with these contradictions in the Revolutionary Era and in the new nation. To give you a handout for that project, which will be due in 2 weeks. 2 weeks. I want you to start thinking of it because we're starting to talk about many of these ideas now. So I'm going to give you this handout now. I'm going to go through it with you really quickly and just sort of see where all this is leading. In your first project, you did some complicated things. You considered colonial America, but you considered it particularly through the lens of gender and from the perspective of women's experiences. So you did women's history. Women's history is a major field in U.S. history that has developed particularly since the 1970s. After the civil rights and feminist movements of the 60s and 70s, you had this whole move to rethink history. These movements reminded historians, particularly American historians, that they had kind of forgotten about half the population, right? Seems commonsensical that historians will realize, hey, we don't talk about women, we're kind of forgetting 50% or more of the population.
Well, you can't remember them, they never talked about.
That's true too. You can remember what you never forget what you never remembered, however the phrase goes. You're right, they never
Really what
considered it,
is.
so all of a sudden to do so would have been actually a pretty radical turn. It takes perhaps a whole political movement to push them in that direction. In this project, what I want you to do is take a similar perspective, but a different perspective in some ways. I'm going to evaluate the American Revolution and or the age of revolution more broadly. It's going to include the new nation into the early 1800s, basically. And I want you to consider some of these quote-unquote contradictions from the perspective of either the enslaved or just African Americans generally. In the Revolutionary War, so a lot of what we'll talk about is the Revolutionary War aspect, because that seems to be a major contradiction for some. But think about this into the new nation. There's going to be the contradictions of slavery and freedom, contradictions of liberty and bondage, essentially. I tried to lay everything out here. I'll go through this and kind of explain to you what I was thinking, what you'll ultimately be doing. This is really an overview of the entire project. It contains an outline. It contains a list of deadlines and things as well. So I'm going to explain to you what it is I was thinking, and then see if there are any questions. And I want to show you something that will get you started in thinking about this here in a second. Before I lose my voice. Was the American Revolution conservative from the perspective of African Americans, and were blacks its contradiction? There's a major debate still within U.S. history about whether the American Revolution was radical or conservative, whether it was radical or conservative. Just on a general level, was it really radical as we think, or was it more conservative? For example, some historians say, well, economically speaking, it wasn't all that radical. That it was really made for the merchants, for the wealthy slaveholders. That the common people are going to get caught up in this and pulled into this and kind of used in a sense. Because what changes, economically speaking? You're still going to have class divisions. You're still going to have, obviously, the institution of slavery and whatnot. So when Jefferson writes all men are created equal, did he kind of knowingly write that? Knowing that these rights were not going to be extended to most white men, because you had to be wealthy property person to vote, to exercise political power. It was not going to be extended to women. It was not going to be extended to Native Americans, African Americans, these immigrants that are coming over. So does that make it conservative? Some historians have argued yes. Some historians have argued the other side, saying, you know what? It is radical because of the changes, the general changes that are going to be accomplished from it. Right? This questioning of absolute monarchy, this idea of republicanism and representative government by the people. These ideas are so important that we can't label it conservative in that sense. We're taking a more specific perspective in that I want you to look at it through the eyes of people of African descent at this moment in this country. Now you have a lot of choice in here, so I want to describe some of the choices that you have in thinking about this. But the general question is going to be the same for everybody. Where you arrive at from that question is kind of up to you. So we'll get to that in a second. Let me go through the introduction part, and then hopefully it starts to make some sense here, what I want you to think about. By 1770, 1/5 of the population of 13 colonies was of African ancestry. So 20% was of African ancestry by 1770. That's actually a larger percentage than today. So when you think about the significant presence at that moment, how folks would have been seeing these folks every day, this is a very real thing. Almost 95% of the African descendants were slaves. Beginning with the Boston Massacre in 1770 and lasting for the duration of the war, African Americans played a major role in the American struggle for independence. As such, a large percentage of the American population, both slaves and free blacks, were vital to the American and the British causes. In addition to civilians, black soldiers and sailors such as Austin, Dabney, Joseph Ranger, Caesar Tarrant, Oliver Cromwell, proved themselves to be true patriots through their sacrifices in defense of their American homeland. So think about this, 95% of these folks are enslaved, yet many of them are going to fight in the Revolutionary War itself. In fact, 1 of 5 American soldiers was of African descent. Other blacks, such as Boston King, fought just as bravely on the British side, either out of loyalty or in the hope that a sure path toward liberty and racial equality lay with the British Crown. So you do have many African Americans that say, you know what, this war starting, I know which side I'm going to fight for. You've heard the phrase, my enemy's enemy is my friend. So many of them, when the redcoats come, say, hey, you know what, shoot him. He's owned me and my family for several generations. He's my enemy. I'll go with you. Some say, I don't know who these outsiders are that are coming in that are attacking my imagined community, and fight against them. Interesting choice that has to be made at that moment. And it's going to be an individual choice. Some folks choose either side. I want you to think about those choices that folks are making and why they might be making them. Indeed, the ideology of freedom that so characterized the American Revolution proved to be a galvanizing message of the imagined community. Right? Once you let the cat out of the bag, right, people start hearing ideas like all men are created equally. They take it seriously. They start looking at their own lives. Right? White working men look at them and say, wait a second, if we're really equal, why are we living like this? Enslaved folks are saying, are we really created equally? And Mr. Jefferson, as you're writing this document, right, looking out over your own tobacco plantation, is this a contradiction? So I want you to be thinking in these terms about how people may be experiencing the revolution from different perspectives. So think imagined community and its application. American patriots fighting for independence from British rule firmly believed that freedom and self-determination were inalienable rights without which they could not survive. As one famous patriot put it, give me liberty or give me death. That was Patrick Henry. I went to Patrick Henry High School in San Diego, so I'm very familiar with that place. African Americans, however, found themselves confronted with the difficult question of what liberty and freedom actually meant for them. The fact that black patriots chose to fight for American independence, despite the fact that America denied them freedom, became a rallying cry for those who fought for the abolition of slavery in the years that preceded the next great American struggle, the Civil War. It's a long sentence. Basically, it's foreshadowing. Right? The nation is going to be born by the 1780s, but within 80 years, we're going to have an even bigger conflict. Right? The Civil War is going to deal with many of the unresolved issues of this conflict. Many people call the Civil War the second revolution because of the fact that it's dealing with a number of unresolved issues like slavery and lack of freedoms in various ways. So be thinking about that kind of foreshadowing. So here's a set of questions that your answer to these questions will be the beginning of your thesis statement. This is kind of the guiding questions. Probably still some typos in here, cleaned it up a little bit, but yeah, I need some help in terms of my English and grammar abilities. So bear with me. So evaluate the following statements. Your responses to them will be the beginning of your thesis statement / argument. From the perspective of African Americans, was the American Revolution an age of revolution conservative, or could it even be called a contradiction, given the revolutionaries' use of the rhetoric of liberty and freedom, despite their unwillingness to extend these rights to African Americans and while defending slavery? It's a very long sentence, but I want to clarify the first part here first. From the perspective of African Americans, was the American Revolution / age of revolution conservative? A lot of you may choose to focus specifically on the war itself, the war years, the revolution, but I'm not limiting it just to that. I'm saying age of revolution more broadly, which includes this road to revolution. It includes the 1760s, 1770s, actual war years, 1780s, kind of the completion of the war, the Constitution, some of the arguments that are going to come around that, some of the contradictions that are written into that, and the new nation itself. The attempt to end the slave trade and then the decision not to, right? And how things are going to change dramatically in the new nation once we win the war and then decide how this country is going to look. So really this age of revolution is more broadly defined. I'd say anywhere from 1760s to 1820s. You'll have some freedom within that entire period to decide what you're most interested in talking about. A number of folks may talk about the revolution. We'll talk about that, but you don't have to just talk about the revolution. I also call it the age of revolution because this one kicks off literally an age of revolution. You know, a few years later, the French have a revolution that in many ways sounds like these American revolutionaries. I'm going to behead their monarch. I'm going to set up, their republic as well. But the French also have some contradictions. Right? They go through their revolution. They say liberty, equality, fraternity for all. But they decide, you know what? We don't want to extend those same rights to our slave colony in Haiti. It's too profitable. It's their most valuable sugar-producing colony, an entire island set up around slavery. We can't possibly extend those rights there. So their revolution kind of stopped there. It didn't extend to Haiti. The Haitians decide, though, you know what, we like those ideas of liberty, equality, fraternity, all men are created equal. We think we're done with the slavery thing. There will be a revolution in Haiti beginning in the 1790s and into the early 1800s. Haiti becomes the second independent republic in the Western Hemisphere, second to the United States, first black independent republic in the Western Hemisphere. So within 20 years, 30 years, there are three major revolutions that happen that are really going to shake up the world. This really is an age of revolution, but it's also one containing a number of contradictions, yes.
I thought the French Revolution was a little extreme.
It does get extreme, especially in the sort of later years, the Reign of Terror and all that. Folks are getting guillotined left and right. And this kind of shakes up the Americans too, even though, like Jefferson, they were heavily in favor of the French Revolution, get a little nervous or concerned about what they call its excesses. But it's a revolution. Revolutions are often violent and bloody. So good question. This is a good question. They decided they needed to, but some say this is, hurt their cause ultimately. So weird, man. I don't know how to do that. Turn it off. Was it done ring on my computer? Macintosh help from someone. But yeah, you are to see this in terms of, you raised a good point too, in terms of reform and revolution. I think I may have put these terms up last time. These terms are often used interchangeably, but they're really not the same thing. Revolution, reform, and revolution. A reformer is someone is an attempt to modify a governmental system to make it more effective, to make it work better, right, to make it fair, more fair. I always use the example of the 1960s and the American Civil Rights Movement. Many people saw Martin Luther King as a reformer. He wasn't trying to overthrow the government or destroy capitalism. He thought that there are actually some good things fundamentally written into the country. They just weren't applied equally. He said the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution are really great ideas. They had sort of the seeds of freedom in them. People just didn't apply them right. You didn't apply them to women. You didn't apply them to people of color. He says if you fully apply it, these could be great documents that can free the world essentially. So he might be considered a reformer. He doesn't want to destroy the system. He wants to make it work better for everyone. Malcolm X has been seen as more revolutionary. Malcolm said, you know what? There's a fundamental problem with the system itself. He says the Constitution justifies slavery. It was written into it. It didn't allow women political rights. Are you surprised that you're going to have problems with racism and inequality if your fundamental documents do these things? You need to throw them out and start over. Throw them out. That's the only way. So revolutionaries want to change the entire system, right? Yet some would say, well, does this apply to the American Revolution? These are terms that are often used interchangeably, but they have kind of different shades of meaning to them. Some say, are those founding fathers, were they revolutionaries, really? In many ways, yeah, they get rid of, the king, they set up a whole new society. But do they change everything? Maybe not necessarily. So it's an interesting idea to think about these terms. Terms are important. two more that I use in this draft are radical and conservative. These are kind of complicated, really general terms in some ways. Part of what you're going to have to do is think about them and define them for yourself, how you're using them in these papers. Because what's conservative? Basically, conservative means they want to conserve the system. Right? Similar to reform, maybe in some ways, the system works, you want to maintain it, maintain the status quo. A radical thinks you have to change the system. There's a problem with it. But again, we use these terms in contemporary politics to mean a whole lot of things. Maybe you're conservative in terms of economics, but more radical in terms of some other things. I mean, there's a lot of different ways it could go. So you do have to be careful with language. Some say that revolution always involves violence, like back to your other question. Some say it doesn't necessarily have to. Lenin in the Communist Revolution, for example, you got to have some bloodshed, he would say. Others say, no, not necessarily. You can change things without that. This is going to be important in the new nation as well. We have another revolution of 1800, some say, when Jefferson gets elected, the first time that the parties change. Some folks think we're going to have a bloody revolution in 1800, because that's how it always had been. When you change power, you don't just got to walk out of the White House like, okay, your turn. that never happened. But in 1800, it does. Right? The Democrats are able to get the White House, and there is not bloodshed. So some people say that revolution of 1800 sets an important precedent. We're about to come into another election next year. Right? We don't expect to have any bloodshed when Obama leaves and whoever else comes in. Right? We expect them to, okay, keep the furniture, right? I'll move in, make sure the cable's turned on before I get there. I mean, we sort of expect a certain courtesy in the process. But these things were up for debate in this era. So be thinking about how you think about that. And a lot of questions will be answered by the decisions that you make in terms of some of the stuff here I want to clarify. In attempting to determine whether or not the revolution and the founding were actually more conservative than radical, and in what ways, if any, African Americans demonstrated and or contradicted American notions of freedom. Not even a full sentence. I don't know what I was trying to get at there. In addition, please consider the following themes, aspects as they relate. One of the things you're going to do is choose a main character. You're going to have a number of opportunities to see and hear from several main characters that may illustrate this for you. I've listed some here, some of which come up in a couple of the videos I want to show you, and some of them in the chapter and whatnot, and some other documents that I put on Blackboard for you already. So again, you're going to think about a specific character and kind of looking at through their eyes at this age of revolution to decide whether you feel like it's a contradiction or not. That's basically what you're doing, looking through the eyes of these main characters in order to make an argument about whether this period is a contradiction or not.
What do you mean by conservative? What do you mean by conservative?
That's what I was talking about here. They think conservative, some argue that the revolution itself is conservative, that they actually conserve more of the same things than they do change. So obviously certain things change when we become the United States, but a number of things stay the same. So the argument that is made or debated, I guess, among historians is the revolution as radical as we think, or is it more conservative? They had the opportunity, for example, to abolish slavery. Right? They're making these arguments about all men are created equal. Why not just clean slate it, abolish it? Everybody gets the right to vote. Women can vote. That would have been truly radical, some say. But that would have been an incredible step. So I want you to think about these terms, radical and conservative, and ultimately decide what you think about them. But generally, conservatives want to maintain the status quo, maintain things the way they are. Radicals want to change. Radicals want change, generally speaking. I mentioned some possible main characters here. Again, many of these folks, most of these folks actually come up in some of the videos, including part I want to show you here in a second. So you're looking at this age, you're looking at this period through particular eyes and from a particular perspective to try to answer this bigger question about whether this age is contradictory or not. You'll notice that actually all of these characters listed are African American figures, except Thomas Jefferson. You'll notice I paired him with someone. Thomas and Jupiter Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson had a slave his same age who was a male. They grew up together. They're friends as young kids. The guy, Jupiter, is trained as his valet, goes off to college with him. They both meet their wives in areas and to the same age. Yet both of them lived through the revolution, but may have seen the revolution quite differently. I may have defined liberty or freedom quite differently. So I think it's interesting to think about looking at the age through their eyes. It may have looked quite different based on whose eyes you're looking at it through. These other figures you'll see interpret the rhetoric of revolution in various ways. Now, I listed a number of characters here, but there's not excuse me, there's not just one story here. All these folks are going to find interesting ways to resist. Resistance is a major theme here. Because once the arguments start being made about all men are created equal and King George is trying to enslave us, the African population is hearing it too. The number of slave runaways increases dramatically. Some of these folks decide to fight for the Americans. Some fight against the Americans. They hear this and say, okay, this liberty stuff sounds good. Even though it's not intended for us, we are going to claim it anyway. You'll see what I mean more when you see these characters. So I want you to think about how their different types of resistance connect back to these larger issues of freedom and defining freedom for themselves. What does freedom really mean? Well, it depends who you ask. On the Blackboard site, there's a folder that says American Revolution Research Folder, something like that. It's week 10 this week. And it contains links to two of the videos that I'll show you parts of the class. It has a couple of websites, a couple of secondary sources, and a couple of primary sources having to do with the revolution. So basically, you don't have to do any outside research outside of the class. You don't have to go to the library if you don't want to. Everything you need will be either in the textbook, in the videos, or in the folder in terms of making your argument, choosing your main character, so on and so forth. I want to make it kind of a self-contained thing. Even though we're working on it over a couple of weeks, I didn't want to make you sort of go to the DC library and have to do all this stuff. You can if you want to. If you have other sources in mind, or you can do that, but you don't have to for this particular project. Just for time constraints, I didn't want to do that to you. There is a general outline on the second page. How Jenny wants you to think about this. Kind of broken down into the different parts of the paper. This ultimately will be a 4 to 5 page paper. Introduction. Set up the background. Talk about the Revolutionary War, the age of revolution. Think who, what, when, where. Like IDs. Your thesis statement is obviously essentially the answer to that main question. Is this a conservative, or is it a contradiction? This revolutionary era, this age of revolution. Right. Why do you believe that? How are you going to demonstrate it? Part of that will involve whichever main character you choose, right, including that information, why it looks the way it does from their perspective. In the body of the project, the largest part of the project, there'll be a couple of different things. One of the things I want you to include in the body of the essay is something about your sources. Something about your sources. I've labeled that here as historiography. You might also call it a review of the literature or any other thing. Historians call this historiography. And I'll say more about that moving forward. Basically, it's a study of how the history has been written. So if you read the textbook, and then you read Lord Dunmore's proclamation, right, you're looking at a secondary source in terms of the textbook, a primary source, Lord Dunmore, right, written at the time. It's kind of an eyewitness account. And you're putting them all together. Right, what these main characters are saying and doing. You're kind of putting it all together. I want you to tell me something about the sources that you've chosen and actually include that in the paper. So again, that 4 to 5 pages starts to fill up. You may end up telling me a page on your sources. Different sources may lead you to different conclusions. Different historians have written different things. So be thinking about your sources and how they lead you to your argument, but also why they might be significant in a number of different ways. And we'll get into more specifically into that. In your conclusion, if you're talking about the Revolutionary War, you might still tell us something about how this impacts the new nation, even if your argument really stops at 1780. Right? How do these contradictions play out moving forward? Because they do. Right? Ultimately, many of these contradictions crop up again as late as the Civil War. So that's a general overview of how the project will look. You see some more specifics there about laying that out. The last part, tentative deadlines. Basically broken this up over the next couple of weeks. Much of it involves things we've already started talking about, but some of it involves things we are going to be talking about. So right now, I'm going to show you actually part of part 2 of the Africans in America video called Revolution. So it's right on topic. You should start reading chapter 6 of the textbook if you have not done so. Some people have already done so, but just to kind of lay it out there. That will be helpful for this project. I have the kind of readings laid out there as they sort of fit. Notice by the 10th, I want you to look at the Blackboard folder and see the sources that are in there, the primary and secondary sources that are in that folder that may be helpful for you. You obviously aren't going to use all of them, but many of them may be helpful. Some of them may be helpful for you. Some of it's actually stuff I included in this introduction to this on this paper. You want to use them to begin to develop your specific thesis statement. I'm going to have you actually turn in your thesis statement to a Dropbox by the 12th. So you have a specific statement with your argument, with your main characters that you're talking about by the 12th. The total paper is not due until the 19th, so that's about 2.5 weeks, I guess. Yes, ma'am. You don't know what the topic is? The topic is the American Revolution and the Age of Revolution. You're looking at it through the eyes of people of African descent to decide whether or not it was a contradiction, or whether it was conservative and or a contradiction. Right? To make the case that it was or that it was not contradictory based on, from the perspective of African Americans, essentially. Now, that's generally what you're doing. Now, more specifically within that, you have some choice, and that choice may depend on your characters, depending on what, if you're talking about the war or the Constitution or the new nation or what have you. You have some flexibility in terms of the time period and in terms of the main characters that you choose to talk about. It should begin to crystallize for you as we, for example, see some of the examples of the main characters I want you to see and pay attention to, because really what you're doing is looking at a specific example and how they experience the revolution. Right? Everybody's going to experience the revolution different, depending on your perspective, your class, your race, your gender, what have you. In this case, we're looking specifically at folks of African descent in order to see how they experience the war and to use that to make a case about whether it's a contradiction or not. The answer to that question is up to you, but it may help you arrive at an answer to think about these main characters, to think about what's happening and what ultimately the outcomes of the revolution are. Does that make any sense? Esther? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It shouldn't all make sense yet, so it's going to be a process, but
We have to turn in the thesis statement on the 12th.
yes.
Is it just the passage with the thesis statement?
Yeah, just a thesis statement. I don't need like a whole page or anything, just a couple of sentences on sort of why you believe what you believe and how you plan to demonstrate it in this particular paper, because that'll give me a heads up on sort of the direction that you're going. And hopefully you too, if you have that crystallized by that point, the rest of the paper can largely begin to write itself. Again, hopefully you'll see a main character that may help crystallize a lot of this for you. I know it's a lot of information that we're sort of throwing at you all at once, but that's kind of intentional because it actually, I think, helps you digest. When we go through all these facts and things, hopefully it helps you digest this process a little more, thinking about it from the specific eyes of or perspective of someone living through it. That's kind of the point, to think about specific and general together. It's one thing to make a revolution. It's another thing to experience it and decide for yourself what does that really mean. What does that really mean? So when Dolly Madison says, "Don't forget about the ladies," she's saying this revolution stuff is great, but am I going to be in the same position I was in before the war? African Americans just say that revolution stuff is great, but am I still going to be a slave? If so, why should I fight for you? Should I fight against you? Other hands.
Are the characters from the movie?
Many of them are. A bunch of them that I listed here are from. There's actually 2 videos that list some of them specifically. So all the ones here come up. But you could choose others. There's some from the textbooks, for example, that may serve as main characters. You really have flexibility in that. But I listed them specifically here because they're really interesting ones that come up and that resist in different ways. Some fight against, some fight for the Americans. And so you're not limited to any one choice in that respect. But yeah, a lot of them are going to come up in this Africans in America video and in the Slavery and the Making of America video, both of which are on the blackboard, but I'm trying to show you most of them in class too.
Is there a list of characters on Blackboard?
There's not a separate list. There's some, where are they? In this, that 3rd paragraph down, I listed some, particularly some of the ones that come up in the first half hour or so of the video, but I didn't put a separate list of characters besides the one in the handout now. Just those for now. It's time to go. Okay. This is what I want you to do. Oh, I said I had one announcement. You guys have been working hard. You been sticking with me. Don't even look at me too mad most of the time. I'm working hard. Really appreciate you guys. You know that? I don't always say it, but I do. Exactly. We're not going to have class Thursday. We have a reading day. Oh, you have a reading day.
I was trying to be like secret about it, but she kind of read my mind.
You have a reading day. You can get started on stuff. You can get caught up in your reading. Start thinking about this, and we will reconvene Tuesday and get back into some of this stuff. These videos are online. I'm gonna play at least probably the first half hour of both of them, but they again will help you in terms of the main characters. So you're welcome to preview them if you want. I'll talk about them more. So next time we'll meet will be Tuesday. Don't come here. Don't come knocking on my boss's door talking about he ain't here. I don't know where he's at. Fire him. We don't meet. And if you are a little secret, yes, sir.
Would you have to pick a character by your thesis statement?
By the thesis time, yeah. I'm trying to get you to do that. I'm trying to get you to include that somehow in your compound thesis and how they help you to arrive at that point. Yes.
Why are we really not meeting?
I still gotta come back.
No, actually my other class already got a day off. You guys didn't get one yet, but I do have to go out of town Friday. So, but I didn't have to not meet you. I like meeting you guys so much.
Game to go to.
No, they are actually better than the Chargers.
Oh man, I think the Texans could have had Derek.
Oh man, I know they're so.
They're like, no, we don't want to call her because the color sucks. I'm like, no, you didn't.
It's funny how these professionals, that's like their whole money you can't possibly have in their car. I was like, really? That's really how you guys are gonna make that decision?
So the characters you gotta pick up from chapter 6 or from 5 and 6.
Yeah, they could be from 5 and 6. Really, anyone from the whole age, from 17, 16, 18, 20. I just picked several ones, especially ones that come from the video that I think are particularly helpful.
And they have to be African American.
I said that, but I included Thomas Jefferson.
Right.
I'm not racist. No, but basically, I want you to think about the contradictions if you choose someone outside of African
Yeah,
Americans.
that's good. It's a contradiction.
Because like with Jefferson, he's writing the Declaration of Independence as he's looking out over the slaves. He's writing all these wonderful words about freedom, really the foundation.
Right.
Good.
He's contradicting himself.
Yeah, and he knew it. And he sort of lives with this contradiction throughout the life. Like,
Right.
really didn't know how to sort of resolve it. At the same time, probably standing close by to him is slaves, the same age, male, whatever.
Saying all men are
So I think, and they're both looking at this revolution, but they're going to see it very different.
Right.
See it
So
very
that's a contradiction.
That's a contradiction, the tension that I'm thinking about. There's a sort of inherent tension in this whole thing.
Okay.
That doesn't even get resolved anymore. It doesn't even get resolved as a result of the issue.
Okay.
It doesn't get resolved until at least the Civil War. Maybe after that.
So chapter 5, 6, and there are a couple of videos. We pick a character, we analyze it. Okay.
Yeah. And you don't have to write the whole paper about the character or anything like that. They're kind of highlight those contradictions.
So the paper doesn't have to be specifically about that one character, but
Now think about how Berkeley did with women, right? She sort of started off with it, but really she
that kind of branched out.
Yeah, about those
Right.
category of women's experience. So
Okay.
that's kind of what you're doing.
Okay.
Good question. First, I have it.
Yeah, since you don't specifically page some paper as specifically on that character.
Yeah, I put them online anyway, but I wanted to show this is the first chapter. Yeah, already there.
But the character is between 5 and 6 or videos. So let's find a character in that time.
Okay, that's okay.
I just checked it out.
I'll see it. Well, I'll make sure that we do it.
Yeah, and the second thing is, when is our next exam? Is it going to be the final?
Yeah, if anything, there'll be like one smaller quiz and then just the final. This is really taking place in the big exam. We'll work that, what's in line over a couple of weeks. But I'll give you notice beforehand. I was thinking of doing a smaller quiz on kind of the revolution stuff, to make sure folks got that. It would be a smaller one.
And approximately which week would that be?
If we have that, it would be,
Oh, in a week?
yeah, in a week.
I mean from Thursday?
Yeah, it would be on chapter 6,
Okay.
which we're doing now. But I haven't decided, especially since I need to miss Thursday or whatever. I'll give you some weekends. But this is the major thing we're doing in the final project. Those are the only two big units.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
See you.
No, thank you.
When it is only one character for
Okay,
you?
that's it.
Or
I'll see you next
only
Tuesday.
one for the?
Yeah, you're only required to choose one. I really don't want folks to choose a whole bunch. Maybe two if it's something like I put Thomas and Jupiter Jefferson together. If it's something like that, you can do it. Because I don't want that to take you too far away from your argument. As long as they help you make your argument, though, and we'll see how it works for you.
From the video or from the web?
Yeah, the ones listed on here, I think all of them actually are talked about in the video.
And we can choose all of?
Yeah, you can choose any of these, or you can choose one from the textbook or somebody else that, you know, feel like there's a character that better illustrates what you want to talk about. That's fine. I chose these because I've been in the video and they do some specific things that I think are going to be interesting in terms of the resistance and how it connects to the revolution. And some of them are from the war itself, like some of these guys are soldiers, but some of them are women, some of them are folks after the revolution and things related to it. So there's some variety in there as well. All right?
I have a question. I'm sorry to hold you.
Now you're good.
Um,
That's why they pay me the big bucks.
I wanted to know if by any chance there was something going on with my Blackboard account because I'm looking at, and you may not have graded them, but I think
Some stuff.
at one point,
Questions?
there was a question, but I answered, for my group, I answered the wrong one. I think I mentioned that to you.
Yeah.
But I don't see that anymore on there. You know, if I click on it and it's submitted already, it'll show me what I submitted.
Yeah.
For the one question, or for the questions rather, I don't see my,
There's nothing on there at all?
no.
I might make sure I didn't do it.
Because I looked at my grade and I said, you know, I didn't do bad on the exam, and I was wondering, I said, well, I wonder what, I wonder if you had looked at that and thought that I didn't turn in, but.
I had a couple of folks tell me that they turned in the wrong thing, and so in order to be able to turn the right thing, I had to delete what was there. I don't think I did that, but maybe if I did, maybe I did it on accident, and I would have deleted so you could resubmit or something. Do you still have it? What you?
I mean,
what
I
you turned in?
wrote what I always type what I write on a Word document, and I have it,
Okay.
but I just didn't want to kind of be.
I'm just behind on the
No,
homework
yeah,
stuff, so I wouldn't have put in a score yet for anybody. I can't tell it individually like what you see, but if it was there and it disappeared, that's either me or it's weird.
No,
there's
because
something wrong.
other things that I put in there are there. It's just that one, and
You could just send it to me via email or resubmit.
that's what I was gonna ask you. What's a good email? Is it the Blackboard or is it the regular?
Yeah, the Montgomery College Blackboard. I see it eventually, but it doesn't let me know stuff is there, so I gotta just go ahead and check.
Okay.
And find it. But yeah, you either resubmit it if it lets you, if not, just send it to me via email and I'll put it in. I'm trying to get caught up on the grade stuff.
Now, and then for the final, should we just be looking at chapter 4, 5, and 6, or is there gonna be more
For
chapters?
this?
Not for this one, but for the final. Just
Oh, yeah, I tend to not make it cumulative all the way back to the beginning. I'll give you a study guide beforehand, but it should probably deal with, it'll probably deal with the period from here to the Civil Wars, like the last 80 to 90 years, not the early stuff. stuff.
Okay.
But I'll give you a study guide.
So you're not feeling like too much from chapter 4? I'm just trying to figure out what I should consume my notebook with.
What was in 4, to tell you the truth. No, I think maybe 5 and up would be
Okay.
better usage.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good question. Ahead of time. I did it ahead of time.
Yeah.
Plus, it makes me think about it.
Okay. All right.
All
Well,
right.
thank you so much. Have a good trip.
You too. Oh, thanks. Oops, did I turn this off? Nope, I did not. Bye-bye.